So welcome back, everybody. I'm going to just talk a little bit about nature connection and then um, invite you to do a short nature connection practice, following which we'll all gather back here and have some discussion about it. So I want to just tell you a little bit about what I mean by nature connection. When I talk about nature connection, when I talk about that triad of mindfulness, nature connection, and self-compassion. Exactly. So, um, by nature connection, I mean the process of paying sensory attention to a natural process or being, or other than human being. So it's the process of paying attention to a natural process or being. And not just paying attention, but paying sensory attention. Uh, Actually using our senses in a similar way that we use our senses, the internal sense, the felt sense, um, when we're practicing mindfulness, in the ways Radley was describing this morning. In a similar way, we use our five senses to connect with a natural process or being. And I kind of feel talking, in some ways, talking to an Irish audience about nature connection feels a little bit like talking about Coles and Newcastle, or whatever the phrase goes. Because in some ways I feel as a culture we're very nature connected. And I think that is true as a generalization. But I think, like everywhere else in the world, things have changed. And studies in the States now, show, and I'm sure it's not that different for young people here in Ireland, but that, young people, teenagers, are spending anything between 6 and 8 hours a day in front of a screen, whether it's their cell phone or whether it's a computer. And they're not spending that time in nature. Not that we spend that much time in nature, but I think many of us growing up in this room, certainly true for me, and I imagine for a lot of you here, we're told to go outside and play, and I'll call you when dinner is ready, kind of thing, So, and that was just a given. So there's a whole phenomena being kind of recognized around this. A writer called Richard Louv, L-O-U-V, has written a book called Last Child in the Woods, and he's described a phenomena which he calls nature deficit disorder. Nature deficit disorder, and it's a kind of form of alienation syndrome, and there's a whole move that's kind of come into being in North America, really, particularly around children and teenagers, helping to kind of remake that connection with nature. So people have outdoor classes, have schools that are based outdoors. I mean, obviously you need a climate that's working with you on that one. But kind of finding a lot of kind of novel ways of increasing that contact and trying to remake that connection. Something else I just wanted to say up front about nature connection is that it's different to nature appreciation. A lot of us will just have a lot of interest in nature. We may be interested in bird watching. We may enjoy hiking. We may enjoy exercising outdoors, and those are all nature experiences. But what's being described by nature connection includes all of that, but is something more. It's a form of mindfulness practice in some ways, and Radley's been encouraging me to use the name mindful nature connection, because it's really bringing mindfulness and nature together, and really bringing the same kind of mindfulness that we bring to the breath to an external natural process. And of course, the breath and breathing is an internal natural process. So nature connection can either be internal or external. So attitude is very important. Attitude, uh, an attitude of respect, of openness, and of gratitude makes a difference. When we approach the natural world or a natural process or another than human being with an attitude of respect, as well as that sort of openness and receptivity that I talked about earlier with the nest in the stream, if we approach nature with that kind of attitude, more is likely to happen. I'll say more about what I mean by that in a moment. There's a lovely book called Another Way to Listen. It's a children's book. It's written by a Native American woman called Bird Baylor and illustrated by Peter Parnell. But it's basically the story about a young boy who is who wants to learn from this old man. I think it's his grandfather. But he knows that this old man knows how to hear the hills, the music of the hills. He knows how to hear the hills singing. And so the little boy asks him, can you teach me how to hear the hills singing? And so the book is basically a set of instructions on how to get from there, get to that place. And one of the instructions the old man gives, which really speaks to this attitude I'm talking about, is this attitude of respect. This attitude that when we enter the natural world, that we're not just kind of entering from a position of thinking that, you know, it's a nice backdrop to human activity, but that we somehow allow for the possibility that we're entering a world of aliveness and intelligence, and even sacredness. So Bird Baylor, this is actually the old man talking to the young boy. He says, if you think you're better than a horned toad or a frog or a lizard, you'll never hear its voice, even if you sit there in the sun forever. So if you think you're better than a horned toad, you'll never hear its voice. So it's something about that attitude of respect, that we allow for the possibility that we're entering a world of living, intelligent beings that have their own sentience, their own intelligence, their own aliveness, that can actually come towards us and affect our lives if we have that attitude of openness and respect. And that we do so with a beginner's mind, with a willingness to be surprised. First into the natural world, we often go with the music in our brain blaring very loudly, whether it's music or whether it's chatter or whether it's our concerns and our worries. And that's often what gets kind of projected on our world around us. And one of the things about nature connection is finding a quality of listening and a quality of presence and a kind of receptivity and an attitude that allows our voice to kind of quieten down so that we can literally and metaphorically kind of hear the voices around us. So what does nature connection do? Well, Richard Louv, who I mentioned earlier, talks about vitamin N, or as the Americans would say, vitamin N. And just it does that incredible vitality that you all know, that if you lie on the earth, or if you walk in the forest, or if you walk by the ocean, and you're just open and receptive. The poet E. Cummings talks about the leaping, greenly spirit of things, just feeling that sort of vitality. So just this incredible aliveness. One of the teachers of nature connection that I've learned a lot from, and was lucky enough to do a time of mentoring with him, is somebody called John Young, Jon Young, Young. And he has written a beautiful book called What the Robin Knows. And it's basically about nature connection, but it's about nature connection through a process that he calls bird language. And so that's What the Robin Knows. And it's not learning to speak kind of whatever the blackbird speaks, or the thrush speaks, or the robin speaks, literally, but it's about really paying attention, in that respectful, sensitive way to the language of birds, and noticing what happens to our sense of vitality, but also to our sense of ourselves with time as we do this practice. Um, so there is this amazing sense of aliveness and and healing, really, that can come. And I suppose, just on that, we just kind of mention that, I mean, for many of us, and, I know this is, I'm sure, true for many people here, when you've been through something really tough in your life, or really tough in your day, or you've been through some major loss of a loved one, or major disappointment, I mean, you may be lucky enough to have a person you can sit with who can uh, be present and hear and receptive and just be there with you. Um, but I think most everyone here will have had the experience of how you can go into nature, into the natural world, with a broken heart and feel somehow held, or somehow it's okay to be there, or somehow you belong there, and some kind of comfort coming from that. Um, so I think nature connection, a bit like mindfulness of breathing, as well as having its kind of immediate health benefits, also has some very profound uh, gifts to offer us. And one of these is sort of helping us to remember who we are. And what do I mean by this? Well, let me just take you through. Um, we think and we feel we're solid, separate individuals. That's the kind of sense of self that most of us carry through the world. We're ourselves, and we have our boundaries, we have our skin, and we have our personalities inside, and we have our ways of thinking. But we think of ourselves as discrete, separate, solid objects that obviously change through life, but it's like the same essential us that kind of continues through them. So there's this kind of sense of continuity and almost kind of permanence around our notion of who we are. And how we interact with our world is sort of a bit like one billiard ball meeting another. It's kind of, we think in very, and experience in very sort of separate terms and very linear terms. And we live with what I think it's Tara Brach called the delusion of separateness. Kind of, it's a collective delusion, but it's one that we carry around with us and we share with many others. But many cultures, and sorry, I misspelled indigenous, I see, but many cultures, wisdom traditions, mystics, physicists, indigenous elders, tell us that that's not who we are, that that's a delusion. Actually, when the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, they say for 35 days without eating and drinking, and just meditating on the question, what is suffering, and what is the freedom from suffering. Um, what came to him was the insight into the nature of reality, and that included the notion from a Buddhist point of view of what's called no self, or anatta. But no self does not mean we don't exist, because clearly we exist. It just means we don't exist in the way we thought we existed. We don't exist like those little billiard balls. We exist, but our identity is much more wave-like. We're more like waves that interact with other waves. We're more happenings rather than things. We're more verbs rather than nouns. Process rather than We're relational. We exist. So we do exist, but we exist as process. We exist as what Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist teacher, calls interbeings, with porousness, rather than being kind of like that solid billiard ball with a hard exterior kind of surface. We do have a boundary, but it's a porous boundary, and there's a certain kind of fluidity between us and the beings around us and the processes around us. It's interactive and interdependent. And in Buddhism, they speak of mutual conditioning and co-arising, meaning that whatever we see is the coming together of a collection of causes and conditions in that moment. And the Buddha, when he was trying to describe this, I mean, the Buddha had his awakening or his enlightenment when he was 35 years old. And then he spent the rest 50 years of his life trying to teach it. And at first he said, no, this is just too hard to teach. This is so impossible for us to get our heads around. But he spent 35 years trying to do it. And one of the examples he gave of mutual conditioning is, he said, think of two sheaves of corn kind of up against each other like so. That's how things come into being. So there's some causes, what he calls causes and conditions, and other causes and conditions that just meet in that moment and co-arise to form that particular tree or that particular person. And then they kind of stay, lingers, and then goes back into that kind of sea of causes and conditions. So that's the first thing, is that, and a very profound thing, that nature can bring us, our nature connection can bring us into a profound sense of our deeper identity, our broader identity, that we are in fact much more than we thought we were. What else does it do? Well, the other thing it does is it can really allow us to experience the otherness and the aliveness of other natural processes and beings. There's a group in the States called Bioneers, and they do amazing kind of work around raising awareness for the environment and for social issues, justice issues. But they have this logo, and their logo is, it's all alive, it's all intelligent, it's all connected, it's all relatives. And that you'll recognize is also very much, if you like, the philosophy of indigenous cultures, although they won't perhaps often put it quite into words like that. But that is very much the worldview. All our relations, all our relations. So it's experiencing the otherness of nature and the intelligence and the aliveness. And as we allow ourselves to be affected by that, that can again change our perception of who we are. That can bring us that sense of vitality we talked about earlier. Healing effect. As we experience this, we know a different kind of power. We feel part of something, a sort of a bigger family. Poet Mary Oliver, in her poem Wild Geese, which some of you may be familiar with, she talks about finding our place in the family of things. Finding our place in the family of things. And as we do, it can awaken a desire to do what we can to relieve the suffering of others. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that nature connection practices can either be inner, and we've already experienced some of those today, as mindfulness of breathing, because the breath is, as Radley said, if you try to stop breathing, you can't. Your body will kick in and come up for air, and and that's one of the, can be a very profound moment in meditation when you can surrender your volition and just allow the body to breathe and allow your awareness to be carried by the sensation of the body's breathing. So that's inner nature connection, because the body is nature. We're not separate from nature. But then there's also outer nature connection, and this is what I want to invite you into. A very short exercise, and I've just been outside, so I know it's there, and I know it's the weather is okay. It's a little blustery, but it's nice. And what I want to invite you to do is a very short practice. So using the sense of hearing. So I want you to wander out, and many of you, I think many of you work here, so you know the grounds better than I do. And the grounds have changed a lot since I first came here in 1989. When I came here in 1989, there were cows just right in front of the main entrance of the old building. So that was a few years ago. But so I'm going to invite you to wander outside. We're going to take about 15 minutes for this. We want to be back here at 2:15. To find a spot somewhere on the grounds, and there is some beautiful gardens. There's the rose garden, and then there's the bloom garden. Some of you will know, just among the new buildings. Or it may just be to wander out by the trees to the side of the ground. Just find a little spot where you can be on your own. And then what I invite you to do is, if there's somewhere you can sit, or if not, just to kind of stand. Make sure you're warm enough, and I invite you just to close your eyes and to bring all your attention to your sense of hearing. All your attention to your sense of hearing. And what I invite you to do is let's just take 5 minutes for this, because it's going to take a few minutes to get there, a few minutes to come back. Just take 4 to 5 minutes for this, and just allow your ears. And when John Young is teaching this as a practice, he says it's good to bring in storyteller's mind. So imagine your ears as deer's ears, those big kind of radar-like ears, and just be receptive to whatever sounds you hear, whether it's the sound of the wind, or a plane going over, or traffic out in Harold's Cross Road, or bird song. Whatever you hear, just receive it and notice it. So it's really a mindfulness practice, using your sense of hearing. And there's no question as you do this that you're going to think, what am I doing here? This is silly, I'm cold. Was this some kind of silly trick to wake us up after lunch? So all of these thoughts will be coming into your head. But as they do, just as in mindfulness of breathing, notice them, let go of the thought, and then let your attention drop back into the sense of hearing. And just receive, just whatever sounds. And it's not so much about figuring out or naming the sound. It's not about saying, that's a bird song. Or if you're even more familiar with these practices, that's a blackbird, or that's, it's not about naming. You can do that if you like, but it's more about the actual experience of hearing. Sensing. So hearing with your hearing, not just noticing your hearing, but actually hearing with your hearing. Okay? So just invite you to do that, and then let's gather back here at 1:15 or 2:15.